संस्थापकाय च धर्मस्य सर्वधर्मस्वरूपिणे अवतारवरिष्ठाय रामकृष्णाय ते नमः. Good evening. Welcome to our ongoing class on Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. Usually we're holding class only once a month. So our last class was about a month ago. And we came up to Sutra 1.20. So I'm going to remind you of that. One second. So let me first give a heads up on things. So today we'll be discussing Sutras 1.21 to 1.24. Okay? And reading Bryant's commentary on those sutras for parts of them. Pages 79 to 99, a lot of homework, 20 pages. I won't ask you how many of you actually did the homework. And 1.21 and 22, I'm going to blaze through super fast because they're not that interesting and not much to discuss, frankly. And then 1.23 and 1.24 are going to be the focus of today's discussion, which concern the topic, the very interesting and important topic of God, Ishwara, in the Yoga Sutras. It's the first reference to Ishwara in the entire text. Okay. Our next class is next Thursday, October 3rd, 7:30 p.m. And the assignment is to read Yoga Sutras 1.25 to 1.27, the next three sutras, 25 to 27, and Brian's commentary on those sutras, pages 99 to 109. Less homework, only 10 pages. Okay. So now, as I said, let's very quickly go through 1.21 and 1.22 before we move on to this topic of God. So, to remind you about what we discussed last week, 1.20, Shraddha, Virya, Smriti, Samadhi, Prajna Purvaka Itaresham. It's explaining 5 main practices that lead us to the highest goal of liberation through asampragyata samadhi. And we discussed them. Shraddha, Virya, Smriti, they're faith, vigor, memory, absorption in sampragyata samadhi, and discernment between Purusha and Prakriti. And all of that should culminate in asampragyata samadhi, which is tantamount to liberation. Okay? That's the context. Now, immediately following that comes 1.21. Please repeat after me. Tivra samveganam asannaha. Okay. This state of sampragyata samadhi, this is brackets insertion because it's not in the sutra, but it's implied. What was just mentioned in the previous sutra, 1.20, is near for those who apply themselves intensely. Tivra. Okay? And let's look at 1.21 and 22 together. So please repeat after me, 1.22. Mridu madhya adhimatratvat tatopi visheshaha. Okay, even among these, meaning even among those who are applying themselves very intensely, okay, and we'll see, there's some subtlety added by the commentators. Even among these, there's further differentiation of this intensity into degrees of mild, mediocre, and extreme. Okay, so the only thing the real takeaway here is the following. These two sutras explain degrees of intensity in yogic practice. So what 1.21 says is that if you're really intense about your practice, you'll reach the goal more quickly than if you're just kind of lackadaisical about it. That's all. What commentators do is they add 2 more categories because the only word that's used in 1.21 is tivra, okay? And they'll add 2 more words. So tivra corresponds to intense. And what the commentators on 1.21 do is they add, but let's add these 2 other categories. There's moderate and there's gentle, very lackadaisical. And then what 1.22 adds, because Indian philosophers love this, they love categorizing and subcategorizing, they subcategorize gentle into 3 categories. You can be mildly gentle, mediocrely gentle, or intensely gentle. You can be mildly moderate, mediocrely moderate, or intensely moderate, and you can be mildly intense, mediocrely intense, and intensely intense. Which intensely intense that's what we want. Let's be intensely intense about yoga. All right, that's a super quick summary of 1.21 to 22. Now we get to the real meat of the class today. Please don't ask me questions about this. It's going to give me a headache. All right, 1.23, please repeat after me. Ishwara pranidhanat va. Yeah, very interesting sutra. Okay, Ishwara means the Lord, right? Bryant's translation is or. See, va means or. Or. It starts with or. Or. And then you have to explain, well, or, what is an alternative to? Okay, so that's a kind of up in the air, actually, among interpreters. But Bryant suggests, look at his square brackets, or this previously mentioned state is attainable. Previously mentioned state is, he thinks, wow. This is interesting. Oh my goodness, that's my phone, I think. Huh? Silver alert. Okay. So how do we... Okay, I made it, I clicked on it, and I do hope they find the missing adult. I don't mean to trivialize it. Okay. All right. Wow, after that bracing little intermission. Okay. Back. Intensely intense. Yes. All right. Or the state mentioned in 1.20, this is how Bryant takes it, 1.20, which is sampragyata samadhi leading to asampragyata samadhi, culminating in liberation, moksha. That state is attainable from devotion to the Lord. Pranidhana means devotion. You can also mean sort of devotional surrender. It has this connotation of surrender also. To Ishwara. What exactly is Ishwara? That's the whole point of this class. It's complicated. Okay, and there are many different interpretations. So now, let's begin. Bryant's own commentary is very long on both this sutra and on the next one. He really has a field day with this because he feels very strongly. He himself is a scholar who is also a practitioner, and his tradition is Gaudiya Vaishnavism. So very bhakti-oriented tradition. And I'm not saying he's biased, I'm saying keep it in mind that that's his background. And so here's the way I'd put it. There's only so much space on the board, so I didn't put it on the board. Who or what exactly is God in the Yoga Sutras? That's the question. And there are actually a range of views on this issue among traditional commentators, among modern and contemporary scholars. And we can draw a kind of spectrum. And let's say the left side is, this is like a little bit fancy jargon, but it's pretty obvious what it means. Maximally inflationary conceptions of Ishvara. What do I mean by that? It means interpreting God in the Yoga Sutra as basically like the most supreme God out there, like the kind of God you find in the major theistic religious traditions like Christianity and Islam and Vaishnavism and so on. That's at one extreme. At the other extreme are maximally deflationary conceptions of God, which means what? Oh, God is not really God. Ishvara, he's using the term, which is kind of common at the time, but it would be a serious mistake to interpret Ishvara in the Yoga Sutra to mean the theistic God, which is omnipotent, who creates this universe, who loves us, who responds to our prayers, who can bestow grace upon us. So at this other extreme, right, this maximally deflationary conceptions of God are saying that God is a very idiosyncratic God in Patanjali's philosophy, and don't get it twisted. Don't think that just because the word Ishvara is used, that it's actually the Ishvara that you find in the Bhagavad Gita, for instance, or in the Bhagavata Purana devotional texts. No, it's a very unusual and very minimal conception of God. Barely God, actually, in a sense. And then there's a whole range of views in between that spectrum. Okay? And part of what we'll do today is discuss some of the different interpreters on different parts of the spectrum. Where do you think Bryant is? Take a wild guess. way down at that maximally inflationary conception of God, he's really saying that the conception of God is as strongly theistic a conception of God as you find in the Bhagavad Gita, as you find in Vaishnavism, and so on. Okay? And another interesting question is, where does Swamiji stand? Swami Vivekananda? Somewhere in the middle. I don't know middle, but at least somewhere in between the two extremes, actually. Okay. Why do I say this? Let me read his commentary on this is actually his commentary on 1.24, but it helps us to understand his understanding of Ishwara. So let me read it. Swami Vivekananda says, we must again remember that the Patanjali yoga philosophy is based upon the Sankhya philosophy. Only in the latter there is no place for God, while with the yogis, God has a place. The yogis, however, do not mention many ideas about God, such as creating. God as the creator of the universe is not meant by the Ishwara of the yogis. He's very clearly saying that Ishwara in Patanjali's Yoga Sutras is not a creator God. Okay? According to the Vedas, Ishwara is the creator of the universe. Okay? And he's contrasting the Vedic view with the yogic view, which is that God is not the creator. Okay? That's why I place him kind of somewhere in the middle of the spectrum. Because on the maximally inflationary side of the spectrum, Edwin Bryant, a traditional commentator named Vijnana Bhikshu, if you've heard of him, who was a Vedantin. He was a very theistic Bhakti Vedantin, basically. He belonged to a Bheda school of Vedanta, strongly believed in devotion and the personal God. And so at that extreme, Edwin Bryant, Vijnana Bhikshu, and some other commentators, they hold that basically Patanjali's Ishwara is like the theistic Ishwara that you find in Bhagavad Gita and other texts, which means, well, not exactly, actually. There's a difference here. This is important too. There are two kinds of causality that are relevant here. Instrumental cause and material cause, okay? The standard example used, the analogy used in Indian philosophy is, imagine that there's a potter, a clay potter, and he's got a bunch of shapeless clay, formless clay. He shapes that clay into, let's say, a pot, okay? What is the material cause of the clay pot? The clay itself. That's what material cause means. It's the stuff out of which that pot is made. It's the clay itself. Who or what is the instrumental cause or the efficient cause of the clay pot? The potter, the human being who created the pot, right? Okay, so Bryant's view is that Ishwara in Patanjali's philosophical system is the efficient or instrumental cause of the world, like the potter, but not the material cause of the world. What is the material cause of the world, according to Sankhya and Yoga philosophy? Exactly, Mula Prakriti, here. This would be the material cause. Maybe I should add that. This is the material cause. Yeah. And Ishwara would be the instrumental cause. This is Bryant's view. And this is why I gave this diagram, to kind of give you a sense of how Ishwara might fit into this metaphysical scheme. It would be Ishwara as instrumental or efficient cause, which activates Mula Prakriti to then evolve into Buddhi, which is intellect, Ahankara, which is I sense. And then there's a whole chart, 24 cosmic principles. And alongside, remember that it's a dualistic metaphysics, right? We have a bunch of isolated Purushas. Purusha 1, Purusha 2, Purusha 3. Each one of us has a Purusha. And these Purushas have nothing to do with nature. They're completely separate. And we suffer because we're ignorant of that fact. And we identify with different aspects of nature, of Prakriti. I identify with the body, I identify with the mind, and so on and so forth. So liberation consists in realizing that we are eternal, pure consciousness. Purushas, separate from anything that you find in nature. And so where does Ishwara fit in then? Ishwara, as we find out in the next sutra, 1.25, is a special kind of Purusha. Purusha Vishesha. Okay? So, this extreme, maximally inflated conceptions of God, Edwin Bryant, Vijnana Bhikshu, God is almost like the traditional theistic God of Hinduism. He even goes so far as to say, as we'll see in the commentary, that Patanjali most likely believed that God was either Vishnu or Shiva. And he's got an argument for it. Okay. Even though you'll find, the sutras themselves are very spare. They don't talk about God in much detail. You have to kind of read between the lines. He's claiming that these things are implied by the sutras in different ways. He makes an interesting case, and we'll talk about it. Let me explain briefly why Bryant thinks that Ishvara is the instrumental cause of the world. Nowhere in the sutras does Patanjali suggest that. But what Bryant says is, just because Patanjali doesn't explicitly say that Ishvara is the material cause of the is the efficient cause of the world, that doesn't mean that he's not. And he says, therefore, what we should do is understand the concept of Ishvara in Patanjali's philosophy within the historical and philosophical context in which he was writing. Like very early, nobody really knows exactly, but 100 CE maybe, or 200 CE, roughly along those lines. He's claiming that Gita, and this is, it's a little tricky actually, but many scholars think that Bhagavad Gita, for instance, preceded Yoga Sutras. In which case, Patanjali would have known about the concept of Ishvara in the Bhagavad Gita. In some of the later Upanishads, what is the most theistic of the old Upanishads? Or one of the most theistic of the classical Upanishads? Shvetashvatara Upanishad. It's one of the few Upanishads which talks about supreme bhakti actually, para bhakti, and it has mentions of Ishvara in many places. Of course, many Upanishads talk about Ishvara. So does Brihadaranyaka Upanishad and others. Isha Vasimidam, also the Isha Upanishad. So, Edwin Bryant says, we need to understand what Patanjali means by Ishvara by placing him and his system within the broader historical philosophical context of his time, in which Ishvara is understood in a strong inflationary sense. Okay? At the other extreme is a scholar named Gerald James Larson, who passed away a few years ago. He was a very prominent scholar of both Sankhya and Yoga philosophy. He's written whole books and many articles. And he's written an article, which I've included as a link in under the YouTube description. And he refers to Patanjali's view as an a-theistic theism. Atheistic theism. He's being deliberately provocative here. And it's quite interesting. So, other extreme, remember. So, let me briefly summarize how he understands it. Larson says, you're barking up the wrong tree if you're almost equating or aligning Patanjali's Ishvara with the Ishvara in the Bhagavad Gita or other theistic traditions. That's wildly wrong. And what's most distinctive and important and valuable about Patanjali's concept of Ishvara is that it's so radically different from traditional concepts of God. And that's why Patanjali still speaks to us in the 21st century with so much power and force, and why a system like Patanjali's can appeal to people who don't even believe in the traditional God. So this is Larson's view. God is not personal. What's his argument for that? It's a very quick argument. I want you guys to think for yourself about how convincing you find his arguments on the one extreme, at the other extreme, Bryant's arguments. His main argument is this. 1.25, as we're about to see, explains that Ishvara is completely free from all the kleshas, the afflictions. Right? One of the afflictions is asmita, which means egoism, egoity. Larson's argument is, if God is free from the I sense, asmita, how can he be personal? Without an I sense, you can't be personal. So therefore, God in Patanjali's system is not personal. That's his argument. He says also, Larson says, so God is not a personal being. He is by no means the creator of this world. He plays no role in the creation of this world, not even the instrumental cause. He is not omnipotent. He does not exercise grace or bestow grace upon any of us. You'll find that the Yoga Sutras themselves don't talk about grace. That also Bryant thinks is implied in these sutras and some of the other sutras. And so basically the way that Larson interprets Ishwara is a special Purusha. We all have our Purushas. Really, one of the only differences between Ishwara and us is that Ishwara was never bound. So it's always eternally perfect and free. This does raise another question, though. Going back to one of the big philosophical questions that I kept harping on early on in the class, who exactly is bound and liberated? Because one of the issues philosophically in Patanjali's philosophy and even in Sankhya philosophy is that by definition, the Purusha is supposed to be Nitya Mukta, supposed to be eternally liberated. Even us, ordinary Purushas, if you want to call them ordinary Purushas, non-Ishvara Purushas, are supposed to be eternally liberated and have actually nothing to do with Prakriti. We were never actually bound. And so there's this big philosophical question of, well, then who exactly is bound or liberated? And it gets complicated. That does complicate this issue too, because Patanjali makes it seem as if one of the key differences between Ishvara and us, ordinary Purushas, is that God is not afflicted by any of these kleshas, does not have any samskaras and so on and so forth, is not subject to karma. But none of the Purushas have ever been. Even our Purushas are not. Unless you interpret Sankhya and Yoga in a different way, in claiming that at some point in time, Purusha was somehow bound up with, or mistakenly thought it was bound up with Prakriti. But my own view is that's not really true. If you really understand, if you follow through the philosophical principles of Sankhya Yoga philosophy, I don't think you can really sustain that. I think you have to say that the Purusha is completely pristine and untouched by anything Prakritic, by anything in nature. Okay, but then, as I said, that does raise this question of then how exactly does Ishvara differ from, Ishvara, the super Purusha, differ from ordinary Purushas that we have? Okay, so it's just worth thinking about. But I do want to actually look at some of the commentary because it's very rich and very interesting. So let's begin on page 81. This is the beginning of Bryant's commentary on 1.23. Patanjali here states that the goal of yoga can be attained by the grace of God, Ishwara. This is already he's already throwing in some theistic stuff. The word grace is not used. Ishwara pranidhanadva. The sutra is talking about a spiritual practice, devotional surrender to God. And what Bryant seems to be doing is he's assuming that if it's the case that through devotional surrender to God, we can attain the highest goal of yoga philosophy, liberation, then the only way for that practice to make sense is if God can bestow grace upon us. And God, by his grace, or her grace, depending on how we understand God, is the one who has the capacity to liberate us. Okay? But the word grace is not used. I just wanted to point that out because he's a little bit quick here, I think. Okay, then he says, in this sutra, the theistic element of the sutras is encountered for the first time. The theistic or Ishvaravada element in Indic thought stretches back at least to the late Vedic period. Ishvara, from the root ish, to have extraordinary power and sovereignty, is already used 6 times. And then he goes on to explain all the different scriptures that you find it. Remember, one of his main arguments is you cannot understand Patanjali's concept of Ishvara in isolation from its broader historical and philosophical context and theological context. That's what he's building this case very elaborately right from the beginning, okay? And a little bit later in the same paragraph, he says, Sankhya, and now he's going to be differing from Swamiji. Remember how Swamiji says, Sankhya philosophy, in the commentary I read on 1.24, Swami Vivekananda says, Sankhya is atheistic, does not believe in a God, whereas yoga philosophy does accept a God, except it's not the creator God, but still some kind of God. That was a very common view in Swamiji's time, 1900s, like 19th century, more or less. Now, what Bryant says is, he's talking about the results of more recent scholarship on Sankhya and Yoga. He says, Sankhya, although often represented as non-theistic, this is what Swamiji does, was in fact widely theistic in its early expressions and continued to retain widespread theistic variants outside of the classical philosophical school thereafter, as evidenced in the Puranas, for example, Bhagavata, 3rd canto. Yoga has always been theistic. As Feuerstein and others have enjoined emphatically, the popular academic notion that the conception of God was interpolated into classical yoga is completely unfounded. Some scholars hold the view that this idea of God in the Yoga Sutras is an interpolation, which means it's added later to the scripture, but that Patanjali himself didn't talk about God. Maybe there were some theists who came along centuries later who said, hey, wait, how can this be a completely atheistic philosophy? That's not acceptable. Let's throw in God. Feuerstein says that's absolutely false. And Bryant, of course, seconds that opinion, that God is an organic part of Patanjali's whole metaphysical/spiritual system. Okay? Now, just thinking here. Okay, let's just read the next paragraph then. In his commentary, Vyasa asks rhetorically whether there's any other effective way to attain sampragnata samadhi without delay. As Patanjali indicates in the sutra, devotion to God is such an option. Sri Ramakrishna, in the gospel, many times he says, people practice all sorts of things to awaken the kundalini, pranayama, and other kinds of hatha yogic practices, raja yogic practices, which are often very difficult and which are based completely on your own self-effort. And then Sri Ramakrishna says, you can arrive at that same state, which is a culmination of raja yogic and hatha yogic practices, which is kumbhaka, for instance. Kumbhaka means retention of breath for a very, very long period of time. The breath completely thins out. He says you can attain that through bhakti. You don't need to actually go through the intricate technical procedures taught in these Raja Yoga texts and Hatha Yoga texts. You can arrive at it through devotion to God. You get everything just from meditating on God. Bhagavad Gita chapter 12, as many of you probably know, Arjuna asked this interesting question to Krishna. Which is better, those who are devoted to you or those who who meditate on the impersonal absolute? Those who practice Jnana Yoga or those who practice Bhakti Yoga? And Krishna's answer is emphatic. Those who practice Bhakti Yoga. They're both good, and both can take you to the highest goal, except Jnana Yoga is much harder for most people because of their body consciousness. And therefore, Bhakti Yoga is better, and not just because it's easier. It's easier for most people. That doesn't make it inferior. It actually makes it, but it's even superior in the sense that, I like to use the analogy, if you're trying to reach the roof, and you can reach it by climbing a staircase, you can reach it by climbing a rope, you can use it by using an elevator. Climbing a rope is going to take quite a bit of upper body strength. Only maybe 5% of people in the world might be able to manage. Even then, let's say it takes them 10 seconds to reach the roof. Anybody, including people who are otherwise abled and whatever, can step into the elevator and get to the roof in 5 seconds. So never think that because Bhakti Yoga is accessible to everyone, therefore it must be some kind of, it's for dumber people or for people who are weak and that it'll take longer. It need not. It can actually take you to the goal more quickly, but also more easily. Okay, which doesn't mean that it's easy, but just he's comparing these paths. So arguably, and Bryant seems to take it this way, and I think this va in the Sutra 1.23 suggests that as an alternative to 1.20, so Bryant suggests this, and I find it plausible. He says 1.20, remember, mentions these practices, Shraddha, Vidya, Smriti, all these things. What he says is 1.20 is teaching you to do all these things based on your own self-effort. Like Sri Ramakrishna says about the monkey, the baby monkey holding on for dear life to the mother monkey. If the baby lets go of its hold a little bit, it gets dashed to the ground and killed. And by contrast, Brian is saying, 1.23 is saying, look, that's pretty tough. And there's an easier route for you. You can engage in those same practices, but you don't need to rely just on your own self-effort because there's God. And if you practice devotion to God and surrender to God, you will be like, and now I'm bringing in Sri Ramakrishna, you will be like the baby kitten. And the mother cat very happily takes the baby kitten into its mouth and places it wherever it feels like. And the baby kitten is completely content, just saying mew mew. And is not striving in the way that, these, but attains the goal much more easily. Okay? So I think that there's a similar thrust in this sutra, in some of the other sutras, Ishwara Pranidhanadva, and that's definitely the way that Bryant interprets it. Okay, all right. Now, let's look at page 83. Oh, I should also explain this stuff. Yes, okay. So now, what Bryant does helpfully is, just in his commentary on 1.23, he gives a broader overview of the place of God and the role of God in the Yoga Sutras as a whole. And he says the following. The concept of Ishvara, God, is found in 3 places in the Yoga Sutra. First place is what we've started discussing, 1.23 to 1.28. Here, devotion to God, Ishvara Pranidhana, is an optional means of attaining liberation. Optional. How do we know it's optional? The va. Because of that or, which clearly suggests that there are alternative means, and this is one of them. It means it's not mandatory, it's optional. Is it better? Bryant seems to think so, and some others. But that's up in the air interpretively. But the concept of Ishvara comes up again in 2.1 to 2.3 in the next book. Here, in the very first sutra, devotion to God is taught as a mandatory third practice, which is part of what's called Kriya Yoga. Kriya Yoga has 3 practices. Tapaha, which means austerity, Swadhyaya, which means scriptural study and also japa, and Ishvara Pranidhana, exactly the same term that's used in 1.23 is used there as the third element in what's called Kriya Yoga. And there, it's mandatory. It's not optional. There's no va if you feel like it or if you feel very devotional. No, everybody has to do it. Third reference to God is in 2.32 to 2.45. Devotion to God is a mandatory part of niyama, which is the second limb of Patanjali's Ashtanga Yoga, the famous Ashtanga Yoga. If you've heard anything about Patanjali, you've probably heard of the 8-limbed yoga. The first limb is yama, ethical restraints, restraints. And then second is niyama, ethical observances. And one of the main observances is devotional surrender to God. And there also it's mandatory. So Ishvara takes on a more central and prominent role starting in book 2, actually. The first mention is here, but it's very important to take all the references together. That's the suggestion. And what he says is if you take all the references to God as a whole, what you'll find is that, or what you should infer, is that Patanjali actually gave a great deal of importance to the concept of God in the Yoga Sutras. Okay. Now, let's look at page 84. We're just skipping through because the commentary is very long, but I want to just highlight a few things. Now, I keep using the term theism and theistic God. What do I mean by theism? It means a belief in the traditional God, which has the traditional, what are called omni-attributes. Omnipotence, omniscience, perfectly good, perfectly loving, creates this world, and so on, right? Now, what Bryant points out is, in 1.25, 25, or is it 26? Yeah, 25. We're not going to look at it in detail now, but it's on page 99. But I'm just mentioning it quickly. Tatra niratishayam sarvagya bijam. What we're told is that this Ishvara, this God, is omniscient, all-knowing. It's interesting, right? Because this sutra doesn't say that God is omnipotent. And in fact, no other sutra in the Yoga Sutra says that God is omnipotent. So there are 2 routes you can take interpretively because of Patanjali's silence on whether God is omnipotent, whether God bestows grace, whether God is personal. One is the Bryant route, which is that it's implied that God is omnipotent. Let's see his argument for that first. Page 84. He says, these then, after summarizing this stuff, Bryant says, these then are the gleanings that can be extracted from Patanjali's characteristically frugal sutras. He kind of wishes that Patanjali said a little bit more about God. But anyway, from the first context, meaning 1.23 to 1.28, we learn that the highest samadhi can be attained by dedication to Ishvara, a claim Patanjali will repeat in the 3rd section. This suggests, notice the word suggests, that Ishwara has the absolute power to manipulate the laws of nature. This implies, he says, that God is omnipotent. To circumvent the normal procedures required for practitioners to fix their mind by removing the obstacles to yoga, and somehow to pluck the devoted yogi from his or her material embeddedness simply by an act of grace. We learn that Ishvara is a special Purusha insofar as he has never been touched by karma and samskaras and the kleshas, in short, by the normative influences and conditions to which all Purushas in the world of samsara are subject. As I said, big kind of question mark here, because are any of our Purushas ever subject to any of these afflictions? That's the question. And I lean towards saying no, but then it throws a wrench into the whole conception of Ishvara. Then, continued. In other words, Ishvara has never been subject to samsara, as opposed to us, poor souls, who are and have been. He is an eternal being, since he is untouched by time, and thus he taught the ancients. This indicates that Ishvara is concerned with the well-being of the souls in this world. So now he's also saying that the sutra implies that God is loving. He loves us, another traditional attribute of the theistic God, and actively involved in their upliftment by promoting knowledge. He makes himself available in the form of the repetition of the sound Om. This comes up in a sutra that we'll discuss in a future class, coming up soon, which should be recited, Patanjali seems to imply, in a devotional mood, since its meaning, which should be contemplated, is Ishvara, the subject of devotional surrender. So in a subsequent sutra, Patanjali will say, Tasya vachakaha pranavaha. Pranava, the Om, the mantra Om, is the word that designates God, Ishvara. And you should do japa of that Om, keeping in mind the meaning of Om as Ishvara and meditating on God. And if you do that, you can attain the highest goal more easily than otherwise, than if you rely just on your own self-effort. That's the idea. And let's look at page 85 now. Here's Brian is kind of summing up his interpretation. So it's just worth keeping in mind, and then we can argue about how plausible we find it. He says, thus we can conclude that Patanjali is definitely promoting a degree of theistic practice in the Yoga Sutras. Although in the first context, commencing with the present sutra, 1.23 to 1.28, Ishvara Pranidhana, devotional surrender to God, is optional as a means of attaining samadhi. Patanjali does direct 6 sutras to Ishvara, which is not insignificant, given the frugality of his sutras. He's devoted 6 whole sutras to Ishvara just in the first book. So isn't that significant? Then he says, this devotional surrender is not optional in the second context, Kriya Yoga, 2.1 and 2.3. Since it is likewise not optional in the third context as a niyama, 2.32 to 2.45, in the context of Ashtanga Yoga, which is a prerequisite to meditational yoga, Patanjali seems to be requiring that all aspiring yogis be devotionally oriented in the preparatory stages to the higher goals of yoga. And although in the higher, more meditational stages of practice, they may shift their focus of concentration to other objects. So Patanjali was very broad, and he was very liberal before his time in a way, and would say, if you like to meditate on a flame, go ahead and meditate on a flame. Whatever helps you to concentrate, meditate on that. So Brian gives the sutras here, 1.34 to 38. Even ultimately to any object of their pleasing, 1.39. It's a famous sutra. Meditate on anything you want that helps you to concentrate your mind. But he adds something. He says, they would be best advised, these practitioners would be best advised to retain Ishvara as object of meditation thereafter, since this special Purusha can bestow perfection of samadhi, which other objects, like a flame, for instance, cannot. And then he puts it even more starkly. He says, another way of putting this is that any object can serve as the focus of meditation, but only one object can, in addition to this function, accelerate the attainment of samadhi. Therefore, one would be hard-pressed to find a rationale to pick some other object that does not have this ability. Who would not opt for 2 for the price of 1? If you can pick an object of meditation, of concentration, that not only helps you to concentrate, but gives you the highest goal of liberation, as opposed to any other object of concentration in the world, which can help you to concentrate if it's your pet, favorite puppy or something, or a flame or something. That puppy's not giving you samadhi, but God can. Better to meditate on God than your puppy. Okay. Okay. Then he says, to my reading then, Patanjali, while not blatantly demanding that yogis maintain their devotion to Ishvara in the higher stages of their meditations, does seem to be discreetly, or perhaps not even so discreetly, promoting it. I really like this comment that he makes. He says, I envision Patanjali as being too sophisticated a thinker and practitioner to be insistent about this dimension of the tradition, and too delicate about the sensitivities of the non-theistic orientations of other yogi practitioners on the horizons of his day to be dogmatically exclusivistic. But he is clearly recommending submission to God as the best and most expedient path. A lot of this reminds me of Sri Ramakrishna in a way, because he would say that you can attain God through any number of paths, infinite paths to infinite reality, if you will. But, he says, in this Kali Yuga, bhakti is the best. Because it's the easiest, because there are fewer hazards. Not that it's easy, but it's easier and less dangerous in some respects than Raja Yoga, than Karma Yoga. Karma Yoga is part of Bhakti Yoga in a way, but Jnana Yoga especially. For anyone who has even a little bit of body consciousness, Jnana Yoga is very dangerous and difficult. Okay. And, all right, now let's look at 1.24. Please repeat after me. It's a mouthful of a sutra, so I'll break it up. Klesha, karma, vipaka, ashayaihi, aparamrishtaha, purusha vishesha, Ishwaraha. The Lord, Ishwara, is a special soul, Purusha Vishesha. He is untouched by the obstacles to the practice of yoga. What are those three obstacles mentioned? The first one. That's weird. The translation is missing klesha, as far as I can tell. Right? Yes. Huh? Oh, I see. That's his rendering of klesha. Right. Thank you. Okay. Yeah, correct. He's untouched by the obstacles. That corresponds to kleshas. Second term is karma, which is karma. Vipaka is the fructification of karma. And then you get ashayaha. This is a little bit more technical. He translates them as subconscious predispositions. Let's look at the commentary to get a better sense of what this sutra means. So, he says, Vyasa, meaning that first original commentator on the Yoga Sutras, Vachaspati Mishra, and other commentators dedicate their longest commentaries to this sutra. Patanjali notes here that Ishvara too is a Purusha, but he is Vishesha, special, that is, different and distinct from other Purushas. He briefly lists 4 conditions of samsara from which Ishvara is free, and these are elaborated upon by Vyasa and the commentators. Then he explains them one by one. Klesha first. The cause of samsara is the kleshas, obstacles, ignorance, ego, attachment, aversion, and the will to live. These are the 5 kleshas, which are discussed in 2.3. Under the influence of these, the individual engages in the second item on the list, karma, which consists of one's actions, whether good or bad. Here, I think I beg to differ from Bryant, because he takes karma to mean one's actions. I think it's more plausible to take karma here to mean the karmic result of one's actions. So I do something very ethically good. What happens? That generates punya. The karmic result of doing something good is it generates merit or virtue. There are different ways of translating punya. As a result of that punya, in my next life, if I have to be reborn again, what happens? I am born into more favorable circumstances. That would be the karma vipaka. So my take is the good action is, part of the problem is the word karma is polyvalent. So it can also refer to action. That's what he's saying. So I'm not saying the word can't be interpreted that way, but I think it's more plausible to take. So karma could either mean the physical action itself, or it could mean the karmic result of that physical action, which is the generation either of papa or punya. If it's a bad action, something ethically bad, something unethical, that action creates papa. And as a result of that demerit, in my next life, I'll be born into unfavorable circumstances, for instance. That would be karma vipaka, of the bad action. So I think it's more plausible to take karma here to mean the karmic result of our actions. Yeah.
It says karma and the fructification of karma. So it's like that. To have two separate things of karma, you have to have the action and then the fructification.
Yeah.
He's saying that, to me, that's what he's saying. Karma
Yeah.
consists of one's actions.
Yeah, that's true. But if you take karma in the sense that I'm suggesting, which is papa or punya, the karmic result of actions. No. Remember, there's three things. One is the physical action. Let's say I slap you, just as a fun example. Okay. Let's not get carried away here. Okay, so I slap you. That's a physical karma I'm doing. What happens? That generates papa, which is also called karma. It's bad karma. No, that's not fructification yet. The fructification comes in my next life when I'm born into unfavorable circumstances as a result of that papa. You see what I'm saying? So that's how I take it. Okay. But anyway, I mean, you can, if you like Bryant's interpretation better, go for it. More power to you. Okay. Let's continue. As discussed, actions produce a corollary. Their fructification listed here as vipaka, which is the effect they produce. Every action has a corresponding reaction. But as I said, it fructifies in two ways. I mean, they're in two stages. Physical action fructifies in the sense of generating either papa or punya, and the papa or punya ultimately fructifies as favorable or unfavorable circumstances in our next life. Okay? Chapter 2 will discuss in detail how these reactions manifest as the situation into which one is born, one's life expectancy, and one's life experience. 2.13 to 14, the three Sanskrit words are jati, ayu, and bhoga. These are the three parameters in our next life that are determined by what we did in our previous lives, according to the law of karma. Vyasa, now he talks about ashaya. Vyasa glosses the final term in the list, ashaya, that which lies stored, literally, with vasanas, habits, or clusters of samskaras. And in the next sentence, I find this very helpful because we often hear the terms, if we study Indian philosophy at all, and especially spiritual philosophies, we hear vasanas, we hear samskaras. Are they the same or is there a subtle difference? And he says, while the terms are often used interchangeably, vasanas tend to refer to latent samskaras of past lives, which lie dormant, albeit subconsciously molding personality, habit, and choice. And samskaras to the more active imprints of this life generated at every moment. So hold on. What he's saying here, it sounds a little bit technical. See, samskara is a broader category, and vasana is a subset of those samskaras, which we accrued in previous lifetimes, which kind of unconsciously determine our present behavior in this life. Samskaras, so that gets confusing, as I said, because it's both the broader category and it's the so I wish that he could have, but anyway. But it's like karma, you see? Is karma physical action or is it the papa punya? It's the same problem. But anyway, but there's a subset of samskaras which are generated in this life based on the actions we do in this life, which then have their own consequences in the formation of our character, for instance, as Swami Vivekananda often emphasized. Okay? Then he says, samskaras have to be contained somewhere, and the ashaya is their bed or container in the chitta. It's like what Freud called the unconscious. That is a storehouse of our latent mental impressions. Vachaspati Mishra adds that these vasanas and samskaras, subliminal imprints or subconscious impressions that eventually fructify, lie stored as potencies in the field of the mind. Ishwara is free from all of these four conditions of samsara. Hence, he is a special type of Purusha. Okay. And why don't we read also? I want to be as generous as possible to Brian. So let's read the case he makes for God being the creator God. Let's look at page 89. He says, on a related note, it is generally held, including in traditional philosophical discourse, that Patanjali's Ishwara is not a creator sort of God. So Swami Vivekananda holds that view. Sankhya is criticized. Now, and also, this is important because many of us, we follow and revere Swami Vivekananda, Sri Ramakrishna. Swami Vivekananda has delivered a number of lectures on Sankhya in relation to Vedanta. He has lectures called Sankhya and Vedanta, where he praises Sankhya and saying, oh, they're great. But, and then he points out two main problems. Number one, their doctrine of the multiplicity of Purushas. He says it doesn't make sense. It's not logical. It's better to believe in one non-dual self. Okay. Second criticism is that they don't believe in a real Ishwara as a creator God. And to make the system coherent and metaphysically plausible, you need to put Ishwara at the top here. That's because Swami Vivekananda felt that the original yoga philosophy does not believe that God is a creator of any sort. Whereas what Bryant is saying is that, no, Patanjali himself believed that Ishwara is a creator God, so we don't have that problem that Swami Vivekananda is pointing out in the yoga philosophy. Okay, that's a little background. And Brian is thinking of people like Swami Vivekananda here when he says, Sankhya is criticized in Vedanta, so Swami Vivekananda was a Vedantin, for considering creation to evolve from inanimate prakriti, pradhana, rather than the conscious Brahman of the Upanishads. And the only criticism levied against yoga by this school is that it is viewed to hold the same position. Etena yogaha pratyuktaha. Vedantins, traditional Vedantins, they'll say, Sankhya's biggest problem is that it's missing God. And so it's not able to explain this creation because there's no impetus for creation unless you posit a conscious being, a conscious supreme being that activates Mula Prakriti. Okay. Where are we now? And this Etena Yoga Pratyuktaha, then what these Vedantins do is they say, and because yoga philosophy is based on Sankhyan metaphysics, it suffers from the same problem. And this also seems to be Swami Vivekananda's view. Bryant is challenging that common 19th century view held by Swami Vivekananda and many others by arguing as follows. So Patanjali's Ishvara seems to have been seen in this light, and this is of course significant. Now, there are two types of creatorship. And we talked about this, but I'll just read it quickly. God is material cause. The material stuff of the world emanates from God. And God is efficient cause. God does not create the actual material substance of the world, which is eternal as is he. But it is he who manipulates this stuff to create the world. So that's this diagram. But Patanjali nowhere indicates how he envisioned the relationship of Ishvara with the creation of the world. He doesn't explicitly talk about how God relates to this creation. Argumentum ex silentio is not the strongest type of evidence, especially since Patanjali is not talking about creation in the sections of the text where he mentions Ishvara. What does he mean by this Latin phrase, argumentum ex silentio? Does anyone have a sense here? Yeah, so he's being sarcastic. Yes, which is what? What's the one that he's saying is not the strongest type of evidence? For what? For what's the position that it's evidence for? Exactly, right. Just because Patanjali is silent on the question of whether God is a creator doesn't mean that God is not the creator. That's his argument. He introduces Ishvara in the context of meditation, since that is his project in this text. While he does briefly mention a few attributes of Ishvara, they are relevant to the ongoing discussion on meditation and liberation from samsara, like omniscience that comes up in the next sutra, 1.25, Sarvagya. Creation is an entirely different topic, not connected with the subject matter of the sutras, and thus one has no explicit grounds from the text itself to determine how Patanjali envisioned the relationship of Ishvara with creation. This is his argument. I don't know how plausible I find that argument, because the thing is, this scheme of 24 cosmic principles is fundamental to understanding yogic metaphysics, as it is for Sankhya. And you would think that Patanjali would explain how exactly Ishvara fits into this metaphysical scheme on the Prakriti side, if at all. It doesn't seem like a minor matter. Okay, but let me continue with Bryant. He does correlate Ishvara with Om in 1.27, as we'll find out in the subsequent class, and would have been well aware that Om is a designation for Brahman in the Upanishads, and that Brahman is depicted there and consequently in the Vedanta tradition as the source of creation. And certainly, and this is interesting for those of you who don't study the traditional commentators, and certainly all the commentators do accept the creatorship of Ishvara. That is, Ishvara as efficient cause. And he gives a footnote here listing the commentators, but that's also quite interesting. I mean, even the traditional commentators take God here to be a creator God in the sense of the instrumental efficient cause, not the material cause. In the Vedanta, at least most of the schools of Vedanta, not all, like Madhva school does not accept this. Oh, actually, this is actually a mistake I think that Bryant makes either in this paragraph or somewhere else, where he kind of generalizes about Vedanta taking Brahman to be both the instrumental and the material cause. But in fact, Madhva school takes God to be only the instrumental cause, but not the material cause. Whereas other schools of Vedanta, including Ramanuja's, Vishishtadvaita Vedanta, they hold that God is both the material and the instrumental cause of this world. Okay? Let's read the next paragraph, because he continues to make he says, this seems a fairly important point. Patanjali's compact sutras provide succinct information germane to his specific and immediate project, Chitta Vritti Nirodha, Samadhi. He thus provides whatever information related to Ishvara is immediately relevant. That Samadhi can be attained by Ishvara, that this is possible because Ishvara is omniscient and beyond the kleshas and other sources of ignorance dealt with in the text that impedes Samadhi, that this can be attained by reciting Om, etc. There was no need to extrapolate further, since apart from this commitment to a very delimited focus, there was anyway no paucity of other theistic texts dealing with all manner of additional theological specificities in circulation at the time. So notice the last sentence, what he's saying is, there are plenty of other scriptures, including the Bhagavad Gita and other theistic texts, Shvetashvatra Upanishad, which explain other attributes of Ishvara in great detail. And Patanjali was well aware of these scriptures and had them in mind when he was talking about Ishvara. He's only isolating or singling out certain attributes which are directly relevant to the context of meditation. That's Bryant's argument. Now, since we don't have a whole lot of time, I'm not going to go into details. He spent several pages making a case that the two dominant theistic traditions during Patanjali's time were Shaiva and Vaishnava traditions. And then he makes the case that most likely Patanjali believed in God as Vishnu, even though there's no hint of that, no trace of that in the sutras themselves. Again, he makes a nice point. I like his prose style is very nice. Page 95, he says, this is a little paragraph, about 2/3 of the way down. He says, having said all this, after making this long case for how Patanjali was basically a Vaishnava, one cannot ignore the fact that Patanjali chose not to disclose his understanding of Ishvara other than in the most general categories of relevance to the specific focus of the sutras, Chitta Vritti Nirodha. I like to imagine that Patanjali is too sophisticated and broad-minded a thinker to risk sectarianizing the otherwise universalistic tenor of the sutras and thereby alienating the sensitivities of aspiring yogis with theistic or non-theistic orientations different from his own. That millions of people worldwide continue to find his text personally relevant today speaks to his foresight in this regard. And I think this is very prescient and it's apt. I mean, why is yoga so widely popular throughout the world? Partly because it doesn't harp so much on what seems at least to be a traditional concept of God. But Bryant's whole argument is that if you read between the lines a bit, you're going to find something that comes at least close to a traditional concept of God and bhakti and those kinds of things. I'm not going to read this paragraph, but I wanted to mention also, there's a really interesting sutra, 2.44 in the Yoga Sūtra, which refers to the concept of Ishtadevata. Ishtadevata. And Bryant there said, well, what is Ishtadevata? Typically translated as chosen deity, preferred form of the deity. And many people take the Ishtadevata there to mean these minor deities, which is not God, the full-blown God. Bryant says, no, what Patanjali means by Ishtadevata is referring to God in the form that we love to think of him. So he's like reading the entire Yoga Sutra through the lens of this, basically this theism, this theistic interpretation. Toward the end of his commentary in 1.24, he raises some really interesting questions, and I wanted to just end before opening up the floor to questions. I want to raise a few difficult questions about Ishvara in the Yoga Sutras. So the claim is that the way that commentators understand Ishvara in the Yoga Sutras is that God is a very special Purusha, which is eternally perfect, eternally liberated, but at the same time is associated with pure, perfect Sattva. It's also very significant. Sattva falls on which side, Purusha or Prakriti? It falls on the side of Prakriti. So the first question is, how in the world can Ishwara be perfect on the one hand and associated with Sattva on the other? Because part of what seems to be the definition of spiritual perfection in Patanjali's system is the radical separation of Purusha from Prakriti, that you realize that Purusha has nothing to do with Prakriti. And yet Ishwara is eternally saddled with Sattva. How do you explain this? It's tricky. And I mean, if you go into the weeds, you're probably going to get a headache, and you might get stuck in the whirlpool of scholarly debates. And so he mentions just one commentator who raises and tries to answer this question, Vachaspati Mishra, on pages 96 to 97 of Bryant's commentary. It's at the bottom of page 96. Vachaspati Mishra raises an issue here concerning Ishvara's personality. If Ishvara has knowledge and the power to act, as the previous sutras indicate that he does, since he has the power to bestow liberation on the devoted yogi and thus must be aware of his devotion, and 1.27 informs us that he taught the ancients, does this not mean he has a chitta, mind, which is on the side of Prakriti? But sorry, one thing I forgot to mention, which is important. I explained earlier Larson's case for why God in Patanjali's system is not personal. What was his argument? Because God doesn't have the klesha of asmita, which is an I sense. So it can't be personal. How would Bryant respond to that? He doesn't explicitly respond to that, but I think we can also ourselves try to respond to that. It's possible that God has an I sense that transcends Prakriti. It's different from the Prakritic asmita that ordinary people are afflicted with. So asmita is the Prakritic form of asmita, but there could be a more divine form of asmita that has nothing to do with Prakriti. That's one way of responding to or refuting Larson's position. But also, what are Bryant's main arguments in favor of the view that God is personal? He says, number one, that God has the power to bestow liberation already suggests that it's a personal being. God can't be impersonal and exercise his grace, bestow his grace upon us, and give us liberation if we meditate on him. And 1.27, which we're going to talk about in a future class, tells us that he taught the ancients. He was a teacher. A teacher has to be personal. What do I mean by personal? It doesn't mean in the form of a human being, not avatara. But the person is conscious. God is a supreme person who is conscious, who is loving, who can do the kinds of things that human beings can do, interacting with other people, responding to prayer. These are all attributes of the personal God. Teaching other teachers, the rishis and gurus who then teach us, you see? So Bryant says that the kind of information we get about Ishvara in the Yoga Sutras strongly suggest that God has to be personal. Okay, so now back to Vachaspati Mishra's question though. Doesn't it mean that God has a chitta mind, a prakritic mind? What's the problem with that? Pure consciousness, Vachaspati Mishra reminds us, is unchanging and without object according to the yoga school, and therefore removed from all knowledge and the desire to act. The Purushas don't act. They have nothing to do with this world. Knowledge and desire are thus functions of chitta. In other words, chitta vrittis. Did not the opening sutras of the text inform us that these very chitta vrittis are responsible for bondage in samsara? The chitta itself is a product of Prakriti and thus has its origin in ignorance, avidya. How can Ishvara, who is forever free, be bound by Prakriti and its products and subject to ignorance in the form of chitta vrittis? That's the question, right? I think it's a very difficult question to answer. George Feuerstein, a German scholar, he wrote an interesting article on the concept of God in Patanjali's yoga philosophy. I gave a link in the YouTube description as well, which you can look at. He says in one place in the article, he says, the concept of God sits awkwardly in the system of Patanjali. It's very hard to place it. It's not easy because they have this bifurcation metaphysically between Purusha and Prakriti, and they claim that Ishvara is a special Purusha, and yet, if he's just a special Purusha, God can't interact with the world in any way, and he can't bestow grace, he can't help us in any way. So there has to be some connection with Prakriti. So what do they say? Patanjali says, yeah, so it's connected with, or the commentators say, therefore this special Purusha called God is connected with pure Sattva. But then that saddles him with Prakriti again, which was supposed to be the problem, a source of bondage. Right? So how is it not a source of bondage for Ishvara? Vachaspati Mishra gives a creative answer. Next paragraph, 97. Vachaspati Mishra resolves this dichotomy by supposing that the Lord, even though untouched by nescience means ignorance, appears to assume the nature of ignorance out of his freedom, just as an actor imitating Rama freely assumes the character of Rama. But the actor does not forget his real self. In the same way, Ishvara associates with pure sattva, free from the influence of rajas and tamas, out of his own free will, says Vachaspati Mishra. Now, how satisfying you find that, I don't know. Bryant then goes on to suggest a similar notion in Gita 4.6. Although I am unborn and my nature is imperishable, and although I am the Ishvara of all beings, yet I come into being by my own power, by controlling Prakriti, which is mine. Okay? There's a lot more to be said, but that's one of the questions that I think is a big outstanding question, which is not easy to answer. How, if Ishvara is perfect, how can Ishvara at the same time be associated with Prakriti in the form of pure sattva? Another question, what exactly are the attributes of God? Where on the spectrum do we fall? Each of you should think about this for yourself as you continue to study the Yoga Sutras. Do we lean toward the maximally inflationary conceptions of God, a la Bryant? And one of the traditional commentators that was very extreme in that direction was Vijnana Bhikshu. Or do we lean more toward the Larson view at the other extreme, maximally deflationary conceptions of God, saying that the whole reason why yoga philosophy is so appealing is because it doesn't harp so much on God, and that's why we love it so much. And then there are these intermediate views. Swamiji falls somewhere, Swami Vivekananda falls somewhere in the middle of that spectrum. Where do we place ourselves? The beauty of vagueness and ambivalence and ambiguity in these sutras and in scriptures in general is that it gives us freedom and scope to kind of read and apply the scripture in the way that is most beneficial to us spiritually. That's the nice thing. So in this room, there might be people who are extreme bhaktas. Have a field day with the Bryant/Vijnana Bhikshu interpretation, and feel free to interpret Ishwara in Patanjali's text as basically your Shiva or Vishnu or Ramakrishna or whatever you want. Or there might be other people sitting in the audience who are very anti-theistic, agnostic, atheistic, very skeptical, and let them buy into more of a Larson kind of approach to the concept of Ishvara. But I encourage you to be as rigorous as you can. I mean, within limits. Doesn't mean you have to become a professional scholar or philosopher, but think through your position, because otherwise what happens is later in life, somebody might say, but Patanjali's God it can't possibly be Ramakrishna, because at one point, and they'll start like pulling out sutras which refute your position. Then what do you do? So be prepared. And whatever position you adopt, do it with at least a minimal rigor and care. That's my suggestion. All right? So any questions? Yes, you got a question. Oh, can you pass the mic over?
So we've been talking a lot about devotional surrender to God being a key, and I'm wondering specifically what that means. Like, is that a mental state? Is that certain practices? Like, what more specifically are they referring to?
Sure. Well, Patanjali doesn't help us here, but some of the commentators do. And you can bring in, so the commentators bring in practices like karma yoga. Whatever you do, offer it to God. So Gita is full of that kind of practice. Yat karoshi yadashnasi yaju. Whatever you do, whatever you eat, whatever austerities you perform, offer them to me, to Krishna, says Krishna. That's one example. But there's so many things. Coming to these kinds of classes, attending arati, worshiping God, doing japa, repeating the mantra, the names of God. All of these are different devotional practices.
And then what about the surrender part? Because all of those are very active and intellectual and require the mind. So when they're talking about devotional surrender, what would that be?
I see this as kind of like the culmination of our devotional practices. It's tough. It's tough to be the baby kitten. It's nice to want to be the baby kitten, but it's very difficult. We're all more or less baby monkeys to varying degrees. And the culmination of being the baby monkey is, well, there's a period where we combine the baby monkey paradigm with the baby kitten paradigm, where there's a good helping of self-effort, but there's also some reliance on God and devotion to God. But the culmination is complete surrender. And Sri Ramakrishna will give the example of a bird sitting on the mast of a ship. surrounded by vast expanse of ocean on all sides. The bird gets bored. And so what does it do? It starts flying toward the north for a long time until its wings get tired. It sees nothing, no land. Then comes back, sits back on the mast, recovers its energy. Then it gets bored again. Then it flies to the east, very far, trying to find something to land on. Doesn't find anything, comes back. And it does it in all directions. Finally, what's the culmination? Sits on the mast. Doesn't have any curiosity anymore to go out, to go beyond the mast, to fly off the mast. That's the radical surrender, the total surrender that comes at the end. Bhagavad Gita, the highest teaching. Sarva dharman parityajya mam ekam sharanam vraja. Aham tva sarvapapebhyo mokshishami ma shuchaha. After 18 chapters of the Bhagavad Gita with all sorts of teachings and practices and this and that and Atma, finally Krishna says, if you want to know how to attain the highest goal most quickly and in the easiest way, surrender to me and I'll take care of everything. But it's not so easy. So, yeah.
Thanks.
Okay. Other questions? And anything online? There are. I'll give one more in-person. Oh, why don't we? Okay, let's ask online people, and then it might jog some people into asking their own questions.
Yatra Yogeshwar Krishna.
What was the first word?
Yatra.
Yatra. Okay. Oh, Yatra Yogeshwara Krishna. Yeah. Gita.
Doesn't yoga here include the whole umbrella of yogas, since the Supreme God is the ultimate author as well as end of every type of yoga?
Okay. This person is quoting Bhagavad Gita rather than the Yoga Sutra. Oh my goodness. That's funny. Is it just your phone? Why is it only your phone this time?
They did find her.
Oh.
They did find that person.
Wonderful. That's
Almost
nice.
immediately.
Good.
They told us we lost him, and now they told us.
Look at that. See? It's like us thinking that we're fools, that we're body-mind complexes. Eventually we'll realize we're Purushas. I wanted to mention also, before we get to the next question though, some other questions. That question that I kind of raised earlier, which is that in what sense is God a Purusha Vishesha, a special kind of Purusha? Aren't we all special? In these days, everybody is special, right? And in the yogic sense too, I think each one of us, each one of our Purushas is completely untouched by Prakriti. At least that's one interpretation. You'll find those kinds of statements in the original Sankhya text, Sankhya scriptures, and also some statements in Patanjali. Our Purushas are also ever perfect. So then how are we different from Ishwara in that sense? So that's another question. I think that's tricky. Yes, okay. So with regard to this question, this person is quoting from the Bhagavad Gita, but what is the connection with Yoga Sūtra? That's the thing that, let's try to keep the questions linked to, yeah, so in the Gita, what? Yeah, it's quoting from Gita, and the thing is, the word yoga is used ubiquitously in the Gita and used in many different senses. And it can refer to karma yoga, jnana yoga, bhakti yoga, dhyana yoga in chapter 6, and many other yogas. Arjuna Vishada yoga in chapter 1, which is the yoga of suffering. I gave a talk on it recently in Santa Barbara. So yeah, yoga is a very, very broad term. I like to say that yoga is the closest equivalent we have to the term religion in English. Because the term religion consists of re and then ligio. The word ligament means binding, connecting. So rebinding or reconnecting. Religion is that which reconnects the soul with the divine. And yoga also means binding, not in the Patanjali sense, by the way. Patanjali says yoga means samadhi. But in the Gita, definitely, yoga seems to mean connecting. What? Connecting the jivatma with the paramatma, or with God. Reconnecting the soul with God. So I think that yoga is the best Sanskrit equivalent term to the word religion. And if we understand, conversely, if we understand the English word religion in the sense of yoga, we'll be less likely to poo-poo it and think that religion is crude and outdated and I'm spiritual but not religious, or I'm a religious nun. Religious nuns are very common these days. I think it's like 30% or some huge percentage of the American population identifies as a religious nun, N-O-N-E, which means I don't belong to any religion. Partly it's because I think these people who identify as spiritual but not religious, religious nuns, I think that their definition of religion is impoverished. And it's Like everything bad falls on the religion side. Everything good falls on the spiritual side, or the nun side. But I think there's a more generous way of understanding religion. And I would suggest that the key is understanding religion as a yoga, in the sense of that which reconnects any technology, any spiritual technology that reconnects or rebinds the soul with the ultimate. Questions from anyone who's here? No? We're good. All right. Thank you, everyone. Okay, so I'm going to tell you, again, that's good to recap in any case. Here we go. The assignment is, and the next class is next Thursday, October 3rd, 7:30 p.m. Read Yoga Sutras 1.25 to 1.27, pages 99 to 109 of Bryant's book, the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. And as I said again, under the YouTube description of this class, you're going to find links to 2 of the articles that I mentioned, Gerald James Larson's article and George Feuerstein's. Thank you. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat Shri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu. See, that's Ishwara Pranidhana right there. Surrendering to Shri Ramakrishna. What we just did, we give it to Shri Ramakrishna.